Well, happy Thursday, everybody. Welcome to the Cells of Society seminar for this month. We're excited to be hosting two great speakers on the topic or the theme of biosecurity, and we'll introduce them in more detail in just a moment. But our speakers are Julie Smith and Scott Merrill, and we're looking forward to those conversations. Just as a recap, the Cells of Society seminar is intended to be a cross-pollinating forum for sharing research, education, and extension across CALS. We are fortunate to have an organizing team. I am fortunate to have partners in doing this, I should say, in Hans Estrin, Chris Kaliba, Andrew May, and Allison Neihart. Allison in particular has joined the team and has been doing all of the organization and coordination, which I'm very grateful for. Our overall goal with these sessions is to promote connections across the college and hopefully across the university, transfer knowledge among ourselves, promote transdisciplinary collaboration, and effectively leverage research findings while also identifying new research questions. All of this to support a more collective impact across the college and across the community. We do really benefit from new ideas from the community who listens in and watches these recordings afterward, and you can always submit new ideas for themes or topics at go.uvm.edu/cells2 society ideas, all one word, and the link is there at the bottom of the slide, and we can paste that into the chat box. The way this program is meant to work is on roughly a quarterly basis, and splitting that into sort of a monthly schedule. We plan to have two seminars in a row, one each month, leading up to a quarterly brainstorm session. So the seminars are meant to identify what we've done, what we're doing, what we're learning as a college. And the quarterly sessions, the out-of-the-box brainstorm sessions is what we call them, are meant to have a chance to talk with colleagues about emerging themes for potential new projects or new research questions that we think are worth exploring together. So the next quarterly brainstorm session will be in January, I believe it's January 12th, and that will actually be our next Cells of Society session as well. So here's a rough schedule for the coming year. Thanks to Allison for pulling this together. We have adjusted the schedule this year a little bit to move away from the lunch hour to provide better access for all of our colleagues, and also try to come up with a more regular schedule in terms of day of the month. So we'll be sending these out as calendar invites for everybody, and the themes obviously will be identified in due course. It's also important to remember you can always watch the recordings of these sessions. We do record these seminars, and they are available at the Cells of Society website, which exists within the CALS website. Allison, is there anything else I should have mentioned? Okay. So saying all that, let's get to today's topics. We're real excited to have Julie and Scott join us. Julie will start us off, and Julie will be focusing her presentation on the complexity of saving your bacon, policy and practical challenges of protecting food, animal health. Julie, take it away.
Thanks, Chris. Give me a minute to pull up my slides, and hopefully we get the right one. And we push go. Great. Hopefully you're seeing my slides now.
Yep.
Got a nod. We're good. Okay. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present during today's Cells to Society seminar. I really think these seminars are a great way to bring folks together from across campus and maybe beyond, so we can learn a bit about each other's work and maybe find out a little more about not just what is going on, but how it's being done, and maybe how that might apply to things we want to do in the future. So I also really like how this seminar series is about making connections, because making connections is really what made the project that Scott and I are both talking about today really work. And I do want to give just a little background about the title. I recognize that the play on words may be most appreciated by meat eaters, but it is truly applicable to the project that I'll be talking about because what we did was very relevant to the swine industry. And at a point early on in the project, I asked the team to help me come up with a catchy title for a presentation that I had to give about the project. And this is related to the title that was used for that presentation, so I just think it's kind of catchy. But the reality is that for what we were working on, food animal health, for those who consume food animal products and those involved in the related industries, having a secure supply of bacon or beef, milk, chicken or eggs, and understanding how policies interact with practice to ensure animal health, especially at the farm level, is really important, and it's really complex. And so I want to give you a few highlights of what the team learned as we explored really the human behavioral side of the equation of food animal production and decision making, choices about practices to implement, compliance with practices that are all related to protecting food animal health. And obviously none of this would have been possible without funding, and the specific project that I'll be talking about was called A Human Behavioral Approach to Reducing the Impact of Livestock Pest or Disease Incursions of Socioeconomic Importance. We don't usually use that long tongue twister name. We call it the Animal Disease Biosecurity Coordinated Agricultural Project because it was a coordinated agricultural project funded by USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture, which meant it was one of the large multi-million-dollar 5-year projects. At the time, I believe it was the largest project funded to a project director in the College of Ag and Life Sciences. And we could not have done this work without the funding and without multiple subawards supporting us with collaborators at multiple institutions, our project advisors, and our partners in the swine industry. By the end of the project, we had worked directly or indirectly with collaborators at all of the institutions shown here. And the project involved up to 7 simultaneous institutional subawards, 2 long-term consulting / or vendor contracts, and a few other smaller consulting services agreements. And all of this would not have been manageable without having a project management position built into the project, which resulted essentially in having our own project-specific budget support specialist, Eileen Christie-Anson, who is on this meeting today. And thanks to her oversight, when this project was selected twice randomly for audit due to, random audits that are done over the 6 years that we were running the project, we sailed right through those. So, but I must say, even with that kind of assistance, there was a significant administrative burden for this type of project. We had to not only submit annual reports that all projects do, but we had to provide a complete continuation proposal every year, which was a pretty significant effort. So I'm going to back up a little further, going back to when the project proposal was put together, which was in 2014. At the time, I was an Extension Associate Professor. And through contacts I had made through Extension, through the Extension Disaster Education Network, through previous biosecurity and agrosecurity projects and meetings that I had attended, I had met various people with different types of expertise that I thought would be really helpful in bringing it together to think better, think differently about how we approach disease prevention and response in food animal systems. And I was fortunate that I think all of the folks I reached out to said yes, so I was able to recruit a fantastic team. And there were a couple add-ons who were recommended by folks who I had invited. And so by the time we got started, I knew most of the project team, but most of the people on that team did not know each other. Like they might know 1 or 2 other people. And so that's part and parcel with developing what I would call a brand new multidisciplinary project that you have to spend some time building the team. And the team has to be open to recognizing when the terminology that they use, even though it sounds like terminology that someone else is using, may mean totally different things because of our disciplinary backgrounds. So we had economists and communication specialists and data scientists and ecological modelers and the economists, education folks, experts in risk and crisis communication. So I think you may have gathered from this list of expertise that our project was an integrated project, meaning we had both research and outreach objectives. But overall, the goal was to bring all of these perspectives to bear on how to better influence behaviors that could promote animal health and prevent the introduction or spread of new diseases in food animal production systems. So whatever the commodity you're talking about, whether it's to produce poultry, beef, milk, or bacon, protecting the health of the flock or herd boils down to these things: preventing, detecting, and responding to disease quickly and effectively. Usually this is done according to personal decisions, whether those are of the farm owner or the manager themselves, maybe in consultation with their veterinarian or at the direction of a production system that they're part of. But in the event that what they're dealing with, what's going on in the system, is considered a foreign animal disease, especially if it's a highly contagious disease, now the choices being made aren't just at the farm level. There are state and federal animal health authorities that come into play, that come into the mix and make things a little more complicated, but again, all with the goal of stopping the spread of disease. And I inserted this quote, which I find quite interesting, about emerging, re-emerging, and transboundary diseases being the new normal. You may think this statement was one that was made in the past year or so, but it was not. So Dr. Parker made this statement back in 2015 when he was coming on board as the interim director of the Institute for Infectious Animal Diseases at Texas A&M. However, we now find ourselves there, right? And even though the project that I led was not specifically about zoonotic disease or human pandemics, we can clearly see that a lot of what we were thinking about and what would be experienced in an animal system is what we are seeing with COVID. So back to the Animal Disease Biosecurity Coordinated Agricultural Project. So we had three main objectives. One, to explore the role of risk information and the way it is communicated, and other incentives in terms of their ability to influence biosecurity behaviors. Second, to visualize how changes in biosecurity behaviors affect the spread of disease in production systems. And third, to create educational tools to engage the next generation of agriculturalists in understanding and implementing appropriate biosecurity practices. From a logic model perspective, the project team used the ingredients listed here to conduct our work. We had funding, as I mentioned, from USDA and NIFA. We met together in person for team meetings twice a year for the first 4 years. We arranged multiple interactions with private and public sector stakeholders, and we deployed a variety of methods, including interviews, surveys, and serious games to collect data. With those ingredients, we were able to create a number of products. Some important ones are listed here, and I am happy to say that many of these will live on beyond the end of the grant. The grant period actually ended at the end of March of this year because we were able to tag on a no-cost extension year to our 5 years, so we actually ran for 6 years. So jumping ahead, what you're going to see after the next slide are several slides where I'm just going to share a really high-level takeaway from some of the pieces of work that came out of the project, and they're associated with where you can go for more details. And then I'm going to give a bit of an introduction to the work that Scott is then going to take you into a deep dive to explore. And I threw in the contact slide here just so that there's a more seamless transition from my presentation to the next. So these first two websites listed here, healthyagriculture.org and agbiosecurityproject.org, are related to the Animal Disease Biosecurity Coordinated Agricultural Project. And the third one listed here, secure-agriculture.org, is associated with my current project, which is funded by the National Animal Disease Preparedness and Response Program, which partway through next year will be joined by another NIFA-funded tactical sciences project that are both looking at enhancing our disease response capabilities in New England for animal agriculture again. All right, so here's one from work from The Economist. So one of the important findings that I repeat over and over to people now is that it takes more than education. There need to be other incentives to, in many cases, motivate the adoption of biosecurity practices. And what those incentives are to be effective depends on the experience of the individual producer and the feasibility of the practice in question, or the perceived feasibility of the practice. And we learned that effective messages can be conveyed using the idea model, which means paying attention to internalization and distribution of the message and making sure that explanation and action steps are included. And from a couple outbreaks, case studies that the communication folks looked at, they showed clearly that convergent messages help resolve crises. And I think the opposite, non-convergent messages in their result may be more like our current experience with COVID. I think Scott may talk more about this one and the next one. The types of information can make a difference in terms of whether someone is motivated to adopt biosecurity, and how that information is communicated can make a difference. One cool project that one of the grad students did involving some bots within the game, so like a computerized social peer pressures experiment, showed us that we could explore the effect of social influences experimentally, which was pretty cool. And we showed that not only could risk attitudes be determined experimentally, but we could start looking at what that meant system-wide, that we could see how shifts in risk attitudes could really affect how affect the impact of disease within a production system as we modeled it. So this graphic I credit to Chris Kaliba, and Scott and I both refer to this graphic in our presentations. And here I have straight up the word biosecurity, which I think I've said multiple times without defining, and just want to give an aside here that when I'm talking about biosecurity, what I have in mind is a two-part, has two parts, but are related in that they're a set of policies and practices that are designed to control disease. But in one case, it's really looking at bioexclusion and keeping disease agents out of a production unit or a production system. And the other aspect is biocontainment, meaning if the disease got into part of the system, how do you keep it from spreading within the system?
About 4 minutes, Julie.
Thank you. But because these policies and practices are designed and carried out by people, we have to recognize that biosecurity is not always done appropriately or consistently. And I really like this graphic for thinking about the hierarchy of levels of decision making that can be at play. And so if we look at the top level where strategic decisions are made, the choice is about which biosecurity policies and practices to implement. The mid-level, where tactical choices are being made, tactical decisions are being made, the choice is where and how biosecurity policies and practices should be conducted. And then if you go to the third level, the operational level, here the choice is whether or not to comply with the policies and practices. And so literally the people with their boots on the ground make this choice multiple times during their day-to-day work. And all of these choices have implications, and our work has shown some ways that these choices can be influenced by messages and incentives to support more appropriate and better compliance with biosecurity practices. Can I do this in 3 minutes? We're going to try. So this is just going to be the overview of how the work has related to those tiers, and then Scott's going to do a deep dive more specifically. So one way we've gone about studying these choices is to use digital experimental simulations. So it looks like a video game, but it's overlain on a treatment design. These games have been played by university students, attendees of Pork Expo, Turkers from the Amazon Mechanical Turk Marketplace. And the really cool thing is when we moved from deploying the games on laptops or tablets to mounting the games online, we were able to gather data about new hypotheses from more research subjects more quickly, which gave a lot more power to our work. The game illustrated here, making choices within a production unit, aligns with the lowest level of the decision-making hierarchy, the compliance decisions by those with boots on the ground. In the game illustrated here, we're thinking about decision-making at a higher level, choices about investing in biosecurity when given information about the risk of disease with or without additional information about infection status of neighboring facilities or biosecurity status of those facilities. And then the cumulative choices of those playing this game were categorized to reflect risk attitudes. Were they risk tolerant or risk averse, or did they switch which mode they were at? And we could then take the distribution of risk attitudes, plug them into agent-based models of swine production systems, and see the effects of shifting the distribution of risk attitudes. And an important finding was that a very relatively small shift could have a significant difference in the disease outcome. So this is my last slide. I want to acknowledge especially my colleagues at UVM here who are instrumental in the gaming and modeling work. All of these folks pictured here have been associated with the Social Ecological Gaming and Simulation Laboratory here. I didn't turn on my pointer, I apologize. The faculty folks are on the upper tier, the lower two in the middle are postdocs associated with the project, and the two lower ones on the left and right are grad students who've been associated with the project. And an additional number of graduate students and undergraduate students have also assisted through the course of the project. So now I'm happy to turn things over to Scott.
Thanks, Julie. Yep, go ahead, Scott.
All right. Can people see this this slide here?
Yes.
All right. So thanks, Julie. That was great. You stole a lot of my thunder, but that's perfect. So I did want to really harp on the fact that this really is a team effort. A lot of things that Julie and I are presenting today couldn't have been done without the whole team, including the undergraduates that have done a lot of the coding of the work, and the graduates, as well as the faculty themselves. This really was something that couldn't have been done without everybody just playing along and helping out. And to go back to exactly what Julie was talking about, we're really trying to think about this from a systems perspective, and really looking at how our behavior could affect the spread of disease. That's really the bottom line, is what is this human behavioral component? And how does that actually affect, and how can that influence the models? And should we include it in the modeling systems? We have a lot of data. There's been a lot of research on the epidemiological factors that go into the spread of disease. And we hear a lot about things like R0 and the efficacy of mask wearing, or the efficacy of disease of vaccines. But I think, as we've really seen through this whole COVID outbreak, is that human behavior has a massive effect. Whether someone decides to get a vaccine or not might be more impactful than the difference between a J&J and a Pfizer. So that human behavior and the decisions we make can have massive impacts on the spread of disease. And just to give you a little flavor for some of the things that we've found, one of the games that Julie mentioned was a game where we looked at people's willingness when they had the boots on the ground to follow the rules. And some of the games used treatments where we explained risk information in different ways. One of those games, we looked at using different ways of presenting risk, from just using a number to using a graphical display with some uncertainty, and without changing the risk profile in the system. By just changing the way we talked about it, we were able to have going from 30% of the people following the rules, so most people not following the rules, to 82% of the people following the rules, which is if you think about that, going from 30% to 82%, we didn't change the risk environment. We weren't trying to deceive anybody. We were simply describing the risk in different ways using different mediums. So this is really kind of a potentially terrifying thing to think about. To really stress Chris Kaliba's really cool graphic here, we need to think about these things at multiple levels. We can't just simply say, okay, what's the best policy to put into place and how will that work? Because we have to also see, will that policy be enacted? Will people follow that policy? Will people use the practices that are mandated through those policies? And if those policies are then put into place and they're mandated, and the people that are owners and managers of these places, if they put those things into place, will the people on the ground actually do them? So we need to look at each of these levels to really understand the impact of our different messaging strategies, our different information communication strategies, different policies. So it goes across all those levels. When we're trying to understand the behavioral component of this, we used a lot of different games. I'm going to focus on two games today, and some of the versions that we created from that. One is the boots on the ground. That's the willingness to comply with the protocols that are in place. That's the one on the left. And there's also the willingness to invest when you had more information in tactics. And this was more at the tactical level. So if you were the owner or an operator of a farm and you had information about things around you, different facilities around you, how would you respond? Now, I want to take a step back and think about that epidemiological point of view. The father, many people consider Jon Snow to be the father of epidemiology. It's a different Jon Snow than Game of Thrones, just in case anybody was confused. But Jon Snow was the one that really investigated the cholera outbreak. And he was the one that kind of put together the pieces and found that cholera was being spread in the water. Now, he's considered the father of epidemiology, but one of the key components here is that there's a huge human behavior component that was kind of overlooked or glossed over, and that is that people were going to a well and getting their water in a certain way. So their choices on how to get the water really impacted the spread of cholera. It wasn't just how virulent cholera was or the vector, it was their choice on getting the water in different locations that actually drove this epidemic. Now, when we're trying to understand these human behavioral signals, we're going to try to use as many tools as we can because none of them are perfect. So when Julie mentioned the things that we've done, all these are critical. We've done surveys, we've used our experimental games, we ran our focus groups and ran our workshops. We tried to look at what has happened in the past and incorporate those data. All those things are really important pieces to the puzzle. And each of them have their problems. So when we're trying to pull together a full picture, we really want to start thinking about how all those pieces can be used effectively. Julie mentioned this, but when we're talking about experimental or serious games, these are really cool devices for gathering data. What they allow us to do is to create a kind of a virtual world and place the people in that virtual world and put it into a context. In this case, we're talking about biosecurity. So we have games that look at boots on the ground. We put people in a barn. But then we can actually put conflict on top of that and see how they respond. And then we change the information that we provide them or change the messages. We change some part of the simulation and see how they respond. And we can collect those data and use those data in a variety of different ways. We also really want to make sure that people are behaving in a good way. And the way we do that is we pay them. So in this case, we're paying them to try to get their herds out well. So there's not just frivolous data that they're not just like, oh, I want to see what happens when I get sick or my animals get sick. So we're actually paying them in real US dollars for the decisions they make as long as they're good decisions. And that really forces engagement. It forces like a salience to this problem so that they know that real money is on the line based on their actual decisions. When we actually ran the tactical biosecurity game, what we did is we varied the information that we gave them. We either told them about where the disease was in the system, or we told them how people were trying to protect against disease, or we gave them both those pieces of information or none of that information. We found some really interesting things that go against a lot of the kind of common perceptions. A lot of people talk about just trying to get all the information out there and people will respond the best way. But we found that when we told people about where the disease was in the system, they invested a fair amount of resources. When we told them what other people were doing to protect against the disease, they invested less. And we're talking about a willingness to invest 55% to 37%. So our different communication strategies really influenced people's willingness to try to protect their own herds. And a difference of 55% to 37% is a pretty massive difference if you think about instituting these tactics. As I mentioned before, with different messages, risk messages, we can change people's willingness to follow the rules, take showers when they're going in and out of a barn to protect their animals, from very high numbers to very low numbers, simply by changing the way we actually describe that risk. So the messages themselves can be very, very impactful. As Julie mentioned, we can take this data and we can use a lot of things from it. One is just the straight away use of the data to say, hey, it looks like numbers are a bad way of communicating compared to a graphical display of risk. So you might want to consider that when you're designing your risk components or risk messages. The other thing we can do is we can actually take these data and try to understand more about the distribution of behaviors in individuals. In this case, we might say, okay, we got some people that are on the risk tolerance side. They're in general taking a lot of risks and potentially getting their animals sick. We've got a lot of people on the risk averse side. Those people are doing a lot of biosecurity regardless of the situation or the context. And then we have some people that are kind of in the middle that really use that information to try to make the best decisions possible given the context. Those are our opportunists. So we can use the data from the games to kind of start thinking about the distribution of behaviors that we might see in the world. But we also know that people aren't necessarily stagnant. They change, they learn. So we can also use the data to try to understand how people change over time. What influences them to change? If their animals get sick, do they change? That sort of thing. So we can incorporate an understanding of learning and things like psychological discounting into our models to try to understand how things will actually play out. The way we did this, alluded to by Julie, was we actually developed an agent-based model that had the supply chain as realistically as we could develop from USDA data and lots of other data directly from the industry that represented the facilities and the processing plants and feed mills and movement between all those things. We put on a disease model underneath this. There was a susceptible, infectious, recovered model. It was SIR. And then we overlaid a lot of those human components and the distributions of human behaviors onto that. And we can actually observe some of the potential emergent behavior that will come out of those models. We run these models many, many times. They're stochastic, they're probability based. And each of those little facilities acts as its own little entity. And possibly not too surprising, we see a lot of differences in the spread of the disease and the impact of the disease based on the distribution of behavioral components that we put into the system. So human behavior had a massive impact on the spread of disease in these systems. If we had a lot of risk-averse people, the disease typically kind of went away. However, if we had a lot of risk-tolerant people, there it became pretty interesting because sometimes with a lot of risk-tolerant people, we had really large outbreaks, which we might actually expect to see. But sometimes we had that disease just kind of disappear. To me, this was really interesting because it reflected what we saw with COVID. So in a lot of different communities, people were taking a lot of risk. And yet we did not see massive outbreaks there. In some places, people took a lot of risks and we saw huge outbreaks. And a lot of time was spent parsing what the differences between those communities was. And yet our model suggests that just by chance, by these probabilities, we're going to see some places that have massive outbreaks and some places where the disease will just kind of peter out. So this is almost like deterministic chaos. We actually can see these behaviors, these bounded behaviors in our data, running these models over and over again, where we're seeing things that are reflected with the COVID environment in our disease modeling. Some massive outbreaks, some really small disease outbreaks that just peter out. So when we have risk-tolerant people, a lot of risk-tolerant people in the community, we see a lot of variability in that response. In general, it's much higher, but sometimes it works out just the same as having a lot of risk-averse people. Really fascinating stuff there.
About 5 minutes, Scott.
Thank you. So I want to again stress this data collection. We need to do all these things. You know, we can't just use experimental games because it may be distant from the real world. We need to take surveys. we need to talk to the people that are actually on the ground. We need to do these workshops and outreach. And then using those data, combine all that into some simulation and modeling. That gives us the best idea to put some bounds on the possibilities when we change, say, to different communication strategies or change to different messages. What might be the resultant effects of those things? If we place a new policy into the system, how might things change? And it's not going to be like just the median. It is going to be a collection of possibilities. So we really want to see what that collection of possibilities is. The workshops and focus groups have one other important thing. And I was with a few of our team, I went out to talk to some people in Minnesota about developing some messages at their facilities. And you know, we went through this whole speech about trying to get messages that explain the problem, that told people what to do about that. So there was some action components. We had these things about internalization and really emphasizing that these messages had to really resonate with the people. And then, you know, how to actually, you know, get that message to the people that needed to get it, distribution. And you know, we spent all morning talking about this, and at lunch I was walking around, and one of the managers of a facility walked up to me, and we were chatting, and you know, he said, you know, I would just be happy if I could get my guys to use soap. And my jaw just kind of hit the floor, because I was like, okay, wait, I've been trying to tell you about how to implement tactics and do this, and you can't get your guys to use soap. So it really is helpful to have some grounding, to have us brought back to the real problems that are faced by the industry, so that we can readjust in a way that will actually make the industry better. But you know, to me, this was just like, oh, huh, we're at slightly different levels here, aren't we? I need to figure something else out to get to this soap component. In summary, we know that we need to include these human behavioral pieces in our models, and frequently they're not included nearly enough, in my view. And I think that's really been reflected in the COVID environment, that we really need to focus not on how this disease spreads, but on people's behaviors and how to influence those behaviors. We can see through our models that those behaviors, when we actually do incorporate them, have some really interesting effects that change the bounds of what is possible, that we think is realistic in these systems. So we really do need to include those behavioral effects. We've really learned that the way we talk about information, how we create messages, that really does make a difference. The substantial communication errors that we could actually create or avoid by designing effective messages, it's a very significant thing. And the other thing is that there is a lot of variability between people. I mean, we can give 100 people the same message, and we're going to get potentially 100 different responses from that same message. Some people will respond in the direction we want. Some people will respond in a completely different direction. So we really need to start understanding that variability, the distribution of that variability, and how to target different groups so that we can get effective messages out to maybe the proportion that is hard to reach, the recalcitrant portion. So that individual variability and understanding that is a really critical component. And I think with that, I put on some of the links here to our different games, so that that'll be part of the recording, so people can go on there and actually play some demos if they would like. And I think that is it. I will go ahead and stop sharing here.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Julie, so much.
Do that.
I'm going to hand it over to Chris Kaliba to facilitate Q&A, I think.
I think so, yeah. So thanks to Julie and Scott. As you can probably tell, I'm sort of an embedded member of that project. Yeah, it's just been an exciting body of work, and I think a really great example of transdisciplinary research. And particular thanks to Julie and your leadership, and for pulling the group together across the country, and to Scott for just making sure everything's getting done. So Scott deserves a lot of credit for the results that was displayed there. It was a lot of work. So I'd like to open it up to questions from the group. I have a few, but I'd like to see if we've got any questions from the participants. Leslie.
I have a ton of questions. That was fascinating. I really loved it. Thank you to both of you. But I'm going to limit my questions maybe just to one or two. So one question is, could you give us an example of a specific message that had a big impact? So I realize numbers aren't good and communicating a lot over and over might not necessarily work, but like one example of some change in a message, like what was the sentence? Or
yeah, I mean, I would say that the biggest one with that 82 to 30 as an example, this was in the compliance game. So people had a choice to either go through a shower exit, and if they went through the shower exit, it took more time and they would lose actual dollars, but their animals wouldn't get sick. There's no chance that their animals would get sick, or they could sneak out the back door and get more money, but there was a chance if they did that their animals would get sick. So it's a gamble kind of context that we put these people in. It's a simple choice. All they had to do is make that choice. And what we did is we varied the amount of risk they would face by going out that door from, there's a 1% chance that your animals will get sick to a 25% chance that your animals will get sick. But the way we actually presented that 1% to 25%, we said, it's a very low chance, or it's 1%. Or we actually would use a graphical display to have like a little threat gauge that said basically it's close to 0%. So the little arrow is way over. And when we changed those methods of describing that 1%, we saw radically different responses. And that was at the 5% level that you saw going from a threat gauge to a number. We saw, when we used that threat gauge, almost everybody went with the shower. When we used a number of 5%, almost everybody went out the door.
And so the threat gauge was a graph.
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
Like a stoplight, almost like a stoplight system too. Like red. There was a color scheme to it too, right, Scott?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to get to that slide. I'm not seeing it here.
Okay, and I'll let somebody else go for.
All right, Leslie, but we'll come back to you. So keep.
Yeah.
Sure, there will be some space. Kevin, Scott will pull up and show you the threat gauge a bit. I see Vern and then Hans.
Oh, I think Hans was first, but the message was, my hand was more prominent. So yeah, it just makes me start thinking about all of the different factors that influence human behavior, and this is really interesting, and it's sort of detached, right? These things were on a screen all the time. There's not really a human being there. I'm just thinking back to some of the classical extension behavior influencers, where who's the messenger is a big part of it, right? Instead of us giving the information, you find an early adopter farmer who has that whole social interpersonal connection with the peers, and the same message is received very differently. So just thinking about layering these things, like what is the message, who's giving it, and then the ease of making the right decision. As you were talking about some of these going out the door food safety things, I was recalling a visit when we were in Mexico on a UVM food systems course, and a greenhouse tomato facility that was exporting to the US and had these stringent produce safety standards to follow that the manager was explaining to us. These are completely outside the cultural norm of everybody who works here. And the way they set it up was, it was super easy to make the right decision. You actually had to physically go through this additional room. First, you went to the soap station. There was a little timer with seconds. Then you went to the wash hand station, a timer with seconds, and you could not get into the greenhouse. And it became the cultural norm. Everybody lined up and just did this thing. So the decision was almost taken out of their hands. And so I'm just, again, I think the power of all this is start to put all of these things together to really, not be just so often we focus on one. Yeah, get that farmer presenter, but what is the message that they're giving? Is it numerical? Is it graphic? Is it a story? So yeah, I just think this creates a lot of great food for thought as we continue to try and help people make good decisions. So thanks.
Yeah, Vern, you just touched on about 100 things that I'd like to talk to you about, but I think that the one that I thought was just most interesting is the counterexample to that Julie and I heard, and which was a really well designed. I believe it was in the avian turkey. I think the example we heard was from turkeys. They had a really great biosecurity setup. They had to go through a line of separation where they had a separate set of clothes for outside than inside. They had to shower, all this sort of thing. But they also had a back door that they had an ashtray outside, so people could take their smoke breaks. So they would just sneak out the back door and take a smoke break, and then come back inside, prop open the door, whatever. So the culture wasn't consistent. And you're trying to explain these things. So it's like, oh, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, but then you make it really easy for that person to do it. So it's, I think your example sounds like the right way of doing it. And the example that we heard possibly was the wrong way of trying to give a consistent message about the importance of biosecurity. We also tried to develop a couple games about that trusted messenger, Vern, where we actually had different people presenting the information, but that actually got pretty tricky because we're trying to figure out things like the color of the skin of the virtual avatar that is giving the information. Some of the things we've done with COVID is we're going with Lego yellow just to avoid all that sort of stuff. But it's really tricky to try to put that into a game, but I think it's a really important feature and something that we've really considered a lot.
Thanks, Scott. Hans, and then we'll go to Roy.
Thanks. This is a fascinating presentation. Thanks a lot for organizing and presenting. Yeah, I'm really intrigued by how this whole human behavior impacts science. I think it's an important window into what we call objective science, because, yeah, I won't go into that. I am very interested in social norming as well and the power of that, because yeah, I mean, just as humans and primates, we're pretty much wired to want to be like the group and be on the in. And I remember seeing a very simple little notice. I think it was in the inn of Vermont or something like that, where there's something like most of our customers hang up their towels after they take a shower to save resources. I mean, that was it. But then I got talking to someone who was there who had some social scientists kind of up, and then I did some research on it. And apparently that was a super powerful way to get people to do things. And so I'm putting that out there and wondering if any of this gaming stuff and the way that these are presented includes some of that social norming language. And if so, what might be an example?
I wonder, Julie, maybe you could answer that one. And because you're also working on the extension utility of this, right, in practice.
Sorry, who was? Who?
I was saying, Julie, could you answer that one?
I was just going to say that ties in with some of the other survey work, and there's actually a project that Asim Zia here is leading that picks up on work done previously by someone in another state to ask those very questions. So when asking about whether the individual they're talking with would do a certain practice under a certain condition, they're asked, would they do it? Would other farmers they respect do it? Would entities that they respect expect them to do it? You know, so trying to get at that, the social norming and the kind of the perspective of who would they listen to, like what are their trusted sources for help about making those choices.
And peer pressure, peers obviously, and it builds on what you're saying, Hans, and what Vern was saying, peers, it does matter the most, I think. Right?
So one quick follow up to that, Hans, is we're actually in the process of polishing up a multiplayer game that we can start studying some of those social effects. Really excited about that.
Good. Roy?
Okay, thanks. So fascinating. I'm just agreeing with everybody else that this is pretty fascinating. So in the 1990s, which was in my mind a long time ago, I participated in a number of livestock disease simulations in the Caribbean and South America, particularly around the issue of foot and mouth disease and equine encephalitis, things like that. And I realized that now in the presentations I saw today that I've forgotten a number of very important lessons from that, which is interesting to me. I didn't think so. Here's a question I want to throw at you. If we had actually in most of the world, and certainly in the United States, if we had actually used threat gauges to actually talk about the problems with COVID rather than all these numbers we saw on CNN and elsewhere, do you think that might have elicited a different kind of reaction from people?
Question.
That's a great question.
Yeah, that's a great question, Roy. And I talked with someone recently who was relating what some hospitals have enacted so that when the staff are moving room to room, they kind of get a signal that clues them into how many people have washed their hands that day. And so they're getting that feedback about what the situation is at hand. And it would be really fantastic if we could do that, especially with something like COVID, and have those messages related to the local community. Because one of the problems, there's a lot of problems, but one of the problems I saw with the communications about COVID is you get one picture from the national news and one picture from the state news, and maybe it's a different picture in your community. And so for people to understand what the risk level is where they are, I think would make a big difference.
And there's been, right, so we've done some regional studies. We do have a COVID game that is differentiated by region. And I think we did see some regional differences, right, Scott?
Those were pretty hard to see. We wanted to see bigger ones than we saw, but there was some really interesting ones that were non-intuitive. But we did see some differences, more from the survey than the games, Chris.
Okay. But it does beg, I mean, I would say from a science perspective, the science says use threat gauges.
Yeah.
So that's going to be our recommendation to the federal government, I think, or USDA. It looks like we may be up against time, but Carrie has a question. How do you think communication is the best way to? What do you think? How do you think it is? How do you think is the best way to communicate the importance of biosecurity to those who's got a mindset of, well, we've never had a problem before, so why should I change what I'm doing? Right, the black swan thing. We've never seen it happen. Why should I bother? Have we been able to capture any of that in the study?
So the first thing that comes to mind, Julie, is exemplification. So we've done some work on developing effective messaging. And one of the pieces to what Julie talked about earlier with the IDEA model developed by the CellNows down in University of Central Florida is that you have to explain what the problem is. You have to explain what the person can do to help the action steps. You have to distribute it effectively, but the big one is, or one of the big ones is, you have to make it resonate with that person. You have to have it internalized for that person and how it would impact them with these things. So in that way, what we're looking for is a personal impact, a personal how it really matters to you. And we actually did a study where we showed people a video beforehand, before playing the games. The video was either really just the facts, or there was a second video that really got into this personal impact and how impactful it was for that person's family to actually have the disease come into their facility, and just the trauma that they personally went through. And this is people that actually did this. This was not actors. It was actual on the ground people. We showed them either of those videos or no video at all. And the video that actually went through the personal impact, the people that saw that put the most biosecurity on their facilities. So if we can design effective messages that really resonate with the people, I think we're going to get the biggest bang on those things.
Great. And Chris, just to further triangulate, and then it sounds like we may have to wrap up. You want to mention the COVID tracker a bit and sort of how that dovetails with this?
Yeah, just people may not be aware, but we did a trial of a texting app or an email app that aggregated the national data on COVID cases using the Vermont Department of Financial Regulation model. That you may have seen heat maps generated for the state early on, and then the nation. That model was the source for that. And so we did a trial of an app that would let users select what counties they were interested in across the nation and receive daily updates of trends with links to heat maps. And the feedback, the anecdotal feedback of users was, the fact that it was locally tailored, that they could select what area, what geography they were interested in, the fact that they could get connected to graphical display of that data, and the fact that it was time-based or temporal, in terms of had trend features involved, was all the main value reported by users.
Great. Okay, well, I think we're up against time, right? It's, when I think Chris and Hans were talking about this Cells to Society, the interface between extension and researchers out of CALS was top of mind, and I would just like to point out that this is a great example of how extension can be collaborating with the basic science dimensions of the research we do and carry that forth. I mean, they didn't have a chance, but there's a lot of spin-offs of this. Many other versions of the games, getting into, COVID side, farmer adoption of water quality parameters. And so we've got a state-of-the-art gaming and simulation lab. Folks, reach out to Scott if you've got interest in collaborating. He's doing a great job of working and mentoring students in this space. We want to grow that. And Julie's work is nationally. I mean, Julie, to her credit, is a national expert in biosecurity, livestock biosecurity, and she's widely respected in this space. So again, thanks, and just kudos to my colleagues for your leadership.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I love this. This is great.
Hans, you have a parting thought? I see your hand up. I don't know if
I'm sorry, Hans. I thought that was a legacy.
Might be.
Yeah, I don't have a question.
Cool.
Or a parting thought, except this is great. So agreed.
Well, Chris, I have a parting thought.
Yes.
Exactly, your statement is exactly how I think the idea of extension within the land grant system ought to be continually operationalized.
Great. Okay.
Wonderful. Chris? Thanks so much, everybody. Great to get together again on this. Sorry for the slight lag in these sessions, but we are fired up to keep them going, and appreciate everybody's enthusiasm and interest. See you next time.
Awesome.
Great
Take care.
job.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.